Hi, third graders. Today we are going to continue reading Dragon of the Red Dawn, and we are going to be reading chapter 6. Our goals for today are to explain how an illustration helps me better understand a text and to identify how an illustration supports what is happening in a story. Before we start reading chapter 6, I'm going to review with you the important parts from chapter 5. So the characters from chapter 5 were Jack and Annie, Basho, and the samurai. The setting was in ancient Japan, the streets of Edo, and in a clearing along the Sumida riverbank. When I'm thinking about the important events, I'm thinking about the most important things that happened in the beginning, middle, and end of the chapter. So in the beginning, more samurai confront Jack and Annie, but Basho saves them again by acting like they're his students. In the middle, Jack and Annie have to recite poetry for the samurai. Annie does a good job, but Jack is nervous. And at the end, Jack and Annie walk through the market and across a bridge to Basho's home. So today we are going to be looking at the illustrations again. Now remember, the illustrations are the pictures. And when we're looking at the pictures, we're using them for clues to help us better understand what's happening in the story. So I'm going to just go back and review with you an example of one of the short responses that you wrote for a chapter that we've already read. And you were asked how the picture helps you better understand the excerpt. And so I'm going to go and read the excerpt that you had read to answer the short response question. A large ring had been marked off on the ground with straw. In the middle of the circle, two enormously fat men squatted at opposite sides of the ring. Each man looked as if he weighed more than 400 pounds. They clapped their hands, then each began stomping his feet. "Who are they?" said Annie, her eyes wide. "Sumo wrestlers," said Basho. "Sumo wrestling has been our most popular sport for over 1,000 years." The two wrestlers were now perfectly still. Crouching down with clenched fists, they were glaring at one another. The whole crowd seemed to hold its breath as the wrestlers stared into each other's eyes. Suddenly, one wrestler lunged forward and grabbed the other. Then the hugely fat men began pushing each other around. "They are trying to force each other out of the ring," said Basho. So after reading that excerpt and thinking about how this picture helps me to understand that excerpt, I wrote for a claim. The picture helps me better understand the excerpt by showing me what sumo wrestling looks like. And now I have to support that with two details. What does sumo wrestling look like based on the excerpt? What are those details that I can see in the picture? So I have highlighted my details to show you. So I can see in the picture that the wrestlers are crouching down with clenched fists. And I can see that in the picture. They're both crouching down and they both have clenched fists. So I'm going to put that as my first detail. The text says, wrestlers were crouched down with clenched fists. Now I have to go find another detail that supports my claim. So when I look at the excerpt, I also went back and highlighted a second detail. The wrestlers stared into each other's eyes. I can see in this picture that they're staring into each other's eyes. So I'm going to add that as my second detail. The text also says the wrestlers stared into each other's eyes. So there are two details that support my claim and that I can get from looking at the picture. Okay, so today, as I am reading, I want you to pay careful attention to the illustrations and how they help you better understand the story. Chapter 6, The Banana Tree. "This is your castle?" said Jack. Basho smiled. "In my heart, my humble cottage is grander than all the castles of the samurai," he explained. "And my banana tree is more beautiful to me than all the beauty of the imperial garden." Jack and Annie stared at the large plant with the long, droopy leaves. "I like this tree so much I have taken my name from it," said Basho. Basho means banana tree. "Cool," said Annie. She looked around. "It's nice here." Not really, thought Jack. The cottage was shabby, and the droopy banana tree looked scrawny and sad to him. "Please come inside," said Basho. He slipped off his sandals and left them outside. He picked up a bundle of wood, then ducked through the low door that led into his hut. Jack and Annie took off their shoes too and followed Basho into a small shadowy room. Basho opened his shutters to let in the evening air. "Please sit," he said. "Thank you," said Jack and Annie. Jack looked around the room for chairs, but there weren't any. The only furniture was a low wooden table and a bamboo chest. 3 straw mats covered the earthen floor. Jack and Annie sat down on one of the mats. Basho lit a small oil lamp. Then he made a fire in his fireplace. "I will prepare tea for us," he said. "Rest while I draw water from the river." He picked up one of the 2 wooden buckets near the door and headed outside. When Basho was gone, Jack and Annie looked at each other. "I guess this is a 3-mat house," said Annie. Jack nodded. "You'd think a famous teacher of the samurai would have a 100-mat house, or at least a 50-mat house," he said. "I like this house, though," said Annie. "It's cozy." "I wonder who Basho is exactly," said Jack. "If he's famous, maybe he's in our book," said Annie. "Look him up." "Good idea," said Jack. He pulled the research book out of his bag. By the light of the crackling fire, he looked up Basho in the index. "He is here." Jack turned to the right page and read aloud. "Basho is one of Japan's greatest poets. He wrote short, beautiful poems that speak to people as clearly today as they did during the Edo period of Japan." "Basho's a great poet," said Annie. "That explains everything." "Sort of," said Jack. "It explains why we had to recite poems to the samurai, but it doesn't explain why Basho lives in such a dinky house." Basho opened the door and came in with his bucket. Jack closed the book and slipped it back into his bag. Basho poured river water into an iron pot over the fire. He pulled 3 tiny bowls and a small cloth bag from the bamboo chest. He took loose green tea from the bag and dropped it into the bowls. Then he waited patiently for the water to boil. Jack and Annie waited patiently too. Listening to the soft rushing sounds of the river outside, Jack started to feel peaceful for the first time all day. When the water was hot, Basho poured some into each of the tea bowls. Then he handed the warm bowls to Annie and Jack. "Thank you," said Annie. "Thank you," said Jack. "You are welcome," said Basho. Jack carefully took a sip from the steaming bowl. The green tea tasted bitter, but he didn't mind it. Interesting taste," said Annie. "Basho, Jack was wondering, if you're a famous poet, why do you live in such a dinky house?" "Annie," said Jack, embarrassed. "She's kidding. I wasn't really wondering that." Basho laughed. "Long ago, I trained to be a samurai," he said, "but I was not happy. All I wanted to do was write poetry. A poet does not need to live in a castle. A poet needs to live with the wind and the clouds, the flowers and the birds. Here, I have a small garden and my banana tree. I have the sound of the river all day long. Here, I have everything I need to write my poems." "What do you write about?" asked Annie. "Small things," said Basho. "A crow picking snails out of the mud, a woodpecker hammering a tree, pine needles scattered by the wind. A poet finds beauty in all the small things of nature. And you teach poetry to the samurai? Asked Jack. Yes, the samurai greatly honor the art of poetry, said Basho. Poetry helps focus the mind. The samurai believe a truly brave warrior should be able to compose a poem, even in the midst of an earthquake, or while facing an enemy on the battlefield. Can you say one of your poems for us? Asked Annie. Let me think, said Basho. Well, I was working on a new poem yesterday. He reached for a wooden box under the table. He took a small piece of delicate paper from the box and read aloud. An old pond. A frog jumps in. The sound of water. Basho looked up at Jack and Annie. Said Jack. Nice beginning. It is not just the beginning, said Basho. It is the whole poem. A small moment in time. I think it's great, said Annie. I love frogs. Your poem makes me love them even more. Would you read it again, please? Jack said. He felt like he must have missed something. Basho read again. An old pond. A frog jumps in. The sound of water. Jack nodded thoughtfully. Good, he said. It's really good. And he meant it. The poem made him feel as if he himself had been right there, by that pond, hearing the frog splash into the water, breaking the silence. If you like it, you may have it, said Basho. He handed the paper to Jack. Thanks, said Jack. As he put the poem in his bag, a bell rang softly in the distance. Ah, the temple bells, said Basho. He stood up. It is time to rest. I will take a mat and sleep outside. I enjoy sleeping under the stars. And now, because of the poem you recited today, Annie, I shall think of them as diamonds in the sky. Annie smiled. You can stay inside and cover yourselves with these mosquito nets, said Basho. He pulled some nets from the bamboo chest and handed them to Jack and Annie. But do not worry, in my small house, there are only small mosquitoes, not giant ones like those in the imperial palace. Jack and Annie laughed at Basho's joke. He gave a net to each of them. Then he picked up one of the mats from the floor and pulled it outside, closing the door behind him. The fire in the fireplace had died down. The light from the oil lamp had nearly gone out, too. Jack and Annie lay on the straw mats and covered themselves with the mosquito nets. A cricket chirped on the earth. Jack noticed a patch of light on the floor. He realized it was moonlight coming through the open window. Oh, as I look over here at this illustration, I can see that moonlight also coming through the window. Jack reached out from under the net and put his hand on the square of pale moonlight. He could hear the rustling of the banana plant in the breeze. Half asleep, he imagined himself swaying with its long, broad leaves. This dinky hut is much nicer than a castle, Annie murmured. I feel like we are tiny crickets going to sleep. Yeah, I feel like I'm holding moonlight in my hand, said Jack, and like I'm a banana leaf dancing in the wind. Sounds like a poem, said Annie. Yeah, maybe I should write it down, said Jack. But instead, he fell fast asleep. Okay, so that's the end of chapter 6. So you're going to continue on to your slides, and you're going to start by filling out your culture chart. What did you learn about the Japanese culture from this chapter? And then you have 2 short response questions that you're going to answer. For those 2 short response questions, you are going to look at an illustration and you're going to read an excerpt and be able to tell us how does that illustration help you better understand the excerpt.